All right, welcome back to the show, everybody. As always, it is your host, Yedda. You know that by now. You know my voice. You know, every episode I start with, I am excited. Every time I say I'm more excited than the last. But I am really, really excited to be here today with you because I have my spiritual teacher, David Drake, joining us. David, how are you?
I'm doing well today. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, I have been wanting to get you on the show for quite a while. And as I've learned through my work with you, you just trust timing. It always works out the way that it's supposed to.
Mm.
And the listeners know because I've spoken about you quite a bit throughout the years on the show and the episodes of finding my way into narrative coaching shortly after I got separated and my whole divorce process was happening. And so I don't know if you remember that, but we first met on that free session that I earned when I signed up early or something. I took the bait and hook. It was like, if you sign up now, the first 50 people get a session with David.
Yeah.
And we were in my old house and we hopped
Mhm.
on Zoom and I got to meet you. And that was probably 7 years ago, I want to say. When were you with W. Bex? Was it about seven?
Yeah, 6, 7 years ago. Yes. Mm.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
So for the listeners, this moment is I mean, I'm always referencing, you as my spiritual teacher, David, but the listeners have heard me talk about the Moment Institute, integrative development, narrative release, beyond coaching, all this language that's been interwoven in the show, in my written work, in video format. So we're going to spend the next hour, you all, with Dr. David Drake, and I'm going to call him David, but better known to a lot of people, David, I call you one of my spiritual teachers because you have been for so
Mm.
many years now. And as we get started, I just wonder if you just could maybe just tell the listeners just a little bit in your own words, how do you introduce yourself when you go on to speak to a group or on the
Mm.
stage or on the mic? What do you like to say?
Um, my preference, particularly if I get hired by an organization or a client, is my criteria is I need to be allowed to just be David. If you try to put me in a box, I mean, I'm known for certain boxes, PhD, been in coaching for 25 years, all these things, but then people end up putting you on a pedestal or putting you in this kind of box. And I feel like it always then hampers my ability to just be with them. And so I just try to sort of meet them as David.
I love
And
that.
yeah.
Meet them as David. And that's so I mean, you embody your work. Thank goodness you do, or
Mm-hmm.
we'd all be in trouble if we're following you and we realized you weren't, but you do embody your work. And before we got on the microphone, we were talking about this series that we're in on the show here is, I said, after I learned to shut up and sit, then the question was, how do you learn to stand up and be who
Mm-hmm.
you really are? And your work is so important and has helped so many people all over the world be who they are. And even
Mm-hmm.
in your own answer of, I just want to get to be David. And so I actually want to talk about David for just a
Okay.
little bit. So what was life like for you when you were little? I mean, did you always have this, desire to go into the work that you do now, or was life different for you?
Um, in retrospect, part of why I love stories is because they're told in retrospect. And so a lot of our invitations to our clients is to get them to remember and reflect the formation of their stories and then giving them the sense of agency and authorship to rewrite the story. And so I could frame a lot, like with you, I could frame a lot of my early life as difficult, and parts of it were. So I went to 4 schools by the time I was in second grade, starting second grade. That was my fifth school. Um, I don't feel like in many ways I ever really quite belonged in my family. And so I remember feeling both happy but alone often when I was young. And then over time, I began to look at that's sort of like I am now in a way, but I've made peace with that. And so I think some of the things that may have been challenging for me when I was young have now become some of my greatest assets. So I was an observer, I was a keen observer. I was very curious. I was really smart, but didn't really have a lot of confidence until a few people when I was like around sixth, seventh grade, um, realized and commented that they really loved what I had to say, which was at the time a shock to me. But I think the piece that's really carried through, and I share this a lot with our narrative coaching students, about the primary skill that you need to evolve is the ability and willingness to notice and pay attention to what you notice with compassion, with candor. And so I look back at my early life, uh, loving being in nature, happy to be on my own, curious about the mysteries of all these strange people around me, um, and beginning to find. I think early in life, as you discover yourself, you're searching around for the forms and the places where that might belong. And sometimes we don't always make great choices about that because we're not quite sure how that goes. But I think, as I grew more confident in who I'd become, I realized I wasn't going to be somebody that fit in very easily, like everybody else. And so I thought the only way, frankly, to survive and thrive was to create my own path. And
And
so,
how
yeah,
easy was that, or how hard was that for
it was
you?
very hard because, you have to make money to live in the world, and you have all this pressure to be certain things. And because people see you in a certain way, they, oh, he must have it easy, or he's going to go do all these things. And there's this tension between how you want to be and need to be in the world and how you actually would like to be just yourself. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a tension we play with all of our life. And for me, I found that, and then as a big part of that, you have to figure out what to do with your ego. Because if you don't have enough ego, the world tramples you.
Mm-hmm.
If you have too much ego, you can find some paths to success, but then you pay a high price.
Yeah.
Um, and so, ironically, it took me. I discovered my ego later in life. And the frame that really helped me was, in our profession of coaching, there's a lot of egos that run around,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of worship of celebrities. And I found that wasn't very attractive, but I kept getting kind of put in some of those places. And I thought, I need to, again, find my own path in that. And the frame I came up with was, often we see the ego as a shell or a shield or an armor. I want you to see me this way. I want to be this way. I'm going to project that onto the world. And that never appealed to me. So, but I had to develop enough of that to not be run over by the world,
Mm-hmm.
not be taken for advantage of by the world. And so I've now kind of moved to this place where I see the ego as a backbone. It stands behind me and says, "We've got you."
Mm-hmm.
It helps me be on the alert for people I shouldn't be dealing with. It helps me have confidence to speak quite provocatively and challenge a lot of things in the coaching space. Not because I believe I'm right or you need to believe me, but because I see things, I perceive things that I think we should be dealing with or that seem to be important for humans. And my ego allows me to stay grounded in myself and yet clear and strong in what I'm trying to say.
And I think that's so, so important. You were the first person I ever heard say, who gave me permission in one of the trainings in the integrative development. You said, you have to have a strong ego to do this work.
Yeah.
And my ego just sat up and like it was back in the corner, like being forced to color children's books. And it was like,
Sure.
he's talking about me. Oh my
Right.
gosh. Yes. And like came running up into the front, like I'm all ears. Let's talk about this. So these paradigm shifts that are happening, and I do want to get into them. But the other storyline that I want to come back to is, you said you didn't really develop an ego until later in life. So
Mhm.
you're a kid, you're seeing all these disparities and dissonance and things, that you said, that kind of gave you this language for the world. And then you finish school.
Mhm.
So let's talk about, what was the first thing that you did? If you weren't really developing an ego, where did you go next? Like, what was the first? I think I want to think like being an adult. What was the first job you had? What did you do?
So I postponed that as long as possible. So I did a series of internships with mentors that I admired. I really cared deeply for my father, and I was most like him in our family, but he was gone most of the time for work and was a pretty shy person in his own way. And but so I knew enough instinctively that I needed some other guideposts, and I found that in the form of three I think they were all three men who I admired in the field. I was quite involved in the church when I grew up, not because I was very religious, but because I really admired the community that formed around our particular church. And there was something about the spiritual dimension that was very intriguing to me from very early life, particularly from nature. And because I didn't have the kind of the confidence to like just move out into the world and do things, I did a couple of internships and just kind of travel, find out who I was away from home, be mentored by these people I admired in our field, and end up going to seminary again, not because I had a huge desire, but because it was part of our family tradition. It felt like a really comfortable place to be. It was one of the happiest times of my whole life. And that's where I started to really find my voice. Because the things that I was allowed to study were just so invigorating for me. And I think my ego started to show then, but in ways I didn't quite have the maturity for it. I didn't have the grounding for it. And it was
Mm-hmm.
just kind of like I was busy, I was doing a lot of things, I was very active, I was, one of the better students. But I think it was very ungrounded. It was a sort of a wandering shield, or
Yeah.
it
Where you
didn't,
were still trying to think of it at leading the way out there.
yeah.
I'm curious, why was it one of the happiest times in your life?
Because of the kinds of questions we got to ask, and the things we studied. A lot of it, I mean, I ended up going into the church as a minister for a while. Then I realized it was way too small of a world for me. And I wasn't really super religious even then, but I was just fascinated by rituals and ceremony and spiritual formation. And so I'm quite eclectic in my spiritual journey, but I feel like I do more ministry now than I ever would have done in the church.
Yeah,
I don't
it's
have to.
evident when I hear you and I work with you, and
Yeah,
it is so wonderful. Just this weaving of the story of having your
yeah,
own dysfunction and despair in your own life and
yeah.
childhood and dissonance, and then moving into the spiritual space, because you bring so much of that into narrative coaching.
I
And so
do.
this is why I love hearing people's stories. All of our stories matter. All of our
Mm,
experiences matter
yeah,
to help us make our own contribution into the world. And so you go into seminary and you're in this space of acquiring knowledge and getting permission to ask these big questions, which is another thing. I'll never forget the day you said, Yedda, one of the reasons I like working with you is you love to ask big questions. It was another moment where I thought, no one's ever said that to me.
mhm,
You're right.
yeah,
I do. And so the space of being able to have permission to just
mhm,
experience yourself, it sounds like really brought you joy. But it was still,
yeah.
like you said, the shield was out there a little bit.
A little bit, but that was just, I think, in your mid-20s, you're sort of trying to find your way in the world and navigating that sort of that space between you and the world. But I think part of what the happiness was around was because there were a lot of people like me,
Mm,
really smart, committed to social justice, curious about the spiritual realm. Not most of us within 5 years, all but two of us were gone from the church because that's not what we really wanted. We wanted to just be in this container where we could study these things and explore ourselves. I think it was the first place as an emerging young adult where I got to finally begin to taste what leadership felt like in a way. And I look back now, when I see like nieces and nephews who are that age of 25, 26, I thought it reframed all my stories about myself at that time. Because you
yeah.
have this image of, well, I was this cool person. And they're like, oh man, they were just children with bigger bodies. And
Yeah. Yeah.
so I have much more compassion for myself. But, I think part of what, you know, is just really important about my work is learning to be present as much as possible with what actually is. And so I had this comment yesterday. I did my WVEX Summit, a demonstration of narrative coaching. And one of my points I made was I don't coach people, I don't coach problems, I coach realities
Mm,
in the sense of I want to know what's actually really present here. It may transcend the person, certainly often has little to do with their actual presenting problem. But there's something about, because problems are just realities we don't like.
yeah. exactly. That we
And
want to control. We think if
yeah,
we
or
fix it,
somehow
change it, it'll
fix
change
the,
how we
yeah.
feel. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think, yeah, the besides the church, the easily the biggest influence on me was time in nature. I was often happier in nature than I was with people earlier in my
Hmm.
life. And I liked people, and I was, a friendly, warm kid, I think, in many ways, but um, just for a lot of different reasons, it was not always easy for me to self-regulate. I think now we would have some labels. I was really sensitive to my environment, probably too much so. I picked up too much. I discerned too much. I didn't have any language for. And I always felt both exhilarated and calm in
Hmm.
nature. I
Hmm.
guess that's where I fit. And it's still true. I mean, when I feel like out of myself or out of sorts, um, I go for a hike and then sit under a tree, and then all is well again in the world. And so a lot of what we're doing in the teaching around narrative coaching is helping our clients have that same experience for themselves. So that's why we don't set agendas. We don't tend to set goals. Our only job is what would help you as my client feel fundamentally welcome
Hmm.
and safe here.
Fundamentally welcome. And how did you go from leaving the church to arriving at this wisdom today? What was next on the path for you? How does one get a job when you leave the church? Do they go, did they fire you, David?
Well, sort of they
Do
did.
you not
Uh,
believe anymore?
well, I
Why do
never,
you want to not work for the church?
well, because you realize that the church, like any institution, has its own rules and norms and boundaries. And I remember in our particular denomination, which I have great respect for, because there was a lot of it I loved. It was an extraordinary community of colleagues, probably the closest community of professional colleagues I've had in my whole life, even more than now in a way. But in the church, like one of the things you have to do to get hired is because you're hired by the local congregation, and you have to then go before the regional body, and it's representative of all the churches, and they to affirm the church's choice to hire you. And I'd been through a really difficult divorce, and I was going back to a church where we had gone as a family until I was about 7. So it was an extraordinary interim opportunity. But when I went to the meeting to issue my statement of faith, I basically picked 3 anecdotes from my own life, including like the death of my most favorite mentee in my own life. I'd known her in high school, and she was killed in a car accident the day before I was going to come visit her. And I had 2 other, both positive and maybe negative stories. And I said, this is what I believe in the context of these 3 stories. And this is therefore what I see my job is as a minister. Well, I got just complete flack, particularly from the more conservative members of our church, because they wanted a doctrinal creedal statement. There was the
Hmm.
same regurgitation that everybody else gave. I said, that's not a statement of faith, that's a statement of conformity.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm sharing with you the raw emotion, the raw human experience, because this is what our parishioners bring to us all the time. They
Yeah.
don't want all this fancy stuff. They want a human being to say, like, I remember one couple, they were quite conservative in some ways, but pillars of that church. And their piece was, we've discovered our son is gay. And they were weeping. And I said, so what are the tears about? Like, what is this like for you? And they said, we totally disagree with everything he is and stands for. And we love our son, and we don't
Hmm.
know what to do. And what does God think about all this? And so we started along this conversation. Let's go back to your love for your son. Let's start there. And because they were afraid I was going to be judging them for this, and we had this extraordinary conversation. But long story short, I passed only because I'm smart and articulate, and there's a big church in the region, so they kind of had to say yes. But it said to me, when I looked around the room, there was like 2 or 3 people I knew really well about my age, and I had great respect for. I said, but most of them were like 20 years older than me, and I thought, that this is not my life. I don't want to end up like these people 20 years from now. I've got way more to offer the world. And so I moved up here to Portland, Oregon. And I'd been trained as a grief counselor and worked with a lot of different nonprofits. And I thought, but what does a seminary graduate do that when they're not in the
It's
church?
a trained grief counselor.
Yeah, and so I started doing workshops on change management and loss and transition, and kind of taught myself how to be in business, and then just kept, like an ID, just kept following my nose, like what's showing up? What do I want to have show up? And I didn't have a strategic plan, or I didn't have a lot of business skills at the time, but I just kept kind of leaning into where people seemed interested. And then I realized that what they're interested in doesn't have a label. It doesn't have a category. Um, and I remember there was many examples, but one of my favorites was a woman that had seen me talk on change and transitions, and she was the HR director for a small insurance company of 500,000 people, and they're going through this huge merger and acquisition piece. And she said, "I'd like to hire you." And I said, what for?" She goes, "I don't really know. I just want to have you come be with our people."
Hmm.
So that's what I did. She paid me to wander around and be with the people during this time. And that and a couple of very similar opportunities around that time really said to me, I've been trying to essentially go home. I've been trying to find a home where I belong, which was my life from the very beginning in some ways. Um,
Well, isn't
and
that
then
true for all of us in some
it
way or
is,
another? We're all just
it
trying to
is
find our way home. I mean, Ram Dass made that wonderfully famous, we're all just walking each other home. But in
exactly.
reality, isn't that true?
It is. And so then I thought, so then my choice is, what does that home look like? And why am I looking so hard outside myself to go find that? Because I think it's one of the necessary disillusioning processes of growing up, as you realize there is no home other than in yourself. And
Mm-hmm.
if you can't be at home in yourself, then the rest is an endless chase. And so I started to I sort of accidentally found a few leadership roles in my profession, and one thing kind of led to another, and I ended up with these massive projects of helping our state reinvent a lot of its systems. And but it all was me leaning into something on the edge of what I thought was possible, without having to um, take the normal path to get there.
Yeah. And, as you're talking about that, and we've talked about this languaging before, and I love to read a lot of Richard Rohr
Yeah.
and James Finley. Do you ever read any of James
Hmm.
Finley stuff? Oh my gosh. It just, and it's so interesting. All of my teachers have been in the seminary and in the church
Mm.
first. I follow them. My meditation teacher is an Episcopal priest. So spirituality has that same similar, vein for
Hmm.
me in that space and the questions, because it is a safe space. And this word, and actually the Richard Rohr's newsletter today was all about the edge walker, that
Mm.
prophetic space where we walk on the outside of the inside. And then he says, and eventually those out on the edge actually redefine what is in the middle.
Hmm.
And so as you're leaning into that, and it's interesting, you and I can talk about this, but this isn't normal language. And so for our listeners, some of you are out there on the edge. You are, leaning in, or you don't know
Mm.
if you're leaning in. And because we don't see ourselves as a place of belonging when we're on that, some people call it being a rebel. Some people, you're not coachable, or you don't have what it takes, or we get a lot of negative because that we don't know or understand or think is like us, we usually push out to the
Yeah.
outskirts. So I love hearing your story. And I'm hoping for the listeners, if you hear yourself in that, it's a really great place to be, but it's also a very, like you said, lonely place.
Hmm. It
And
is.
yet you found a way to stay there somehow and then turn that into knowledge, theory, and
Mhm.
create an entire movement. So how did that happen? How did you go from being out there on the outside of the inside, so to speak, being that edge walker, leaning
Yeah.
into what came, and then all of a sudden you find yourself running an international institute, changing the face of coaching? That's big stuff.
It is. Sometimes I
He
marvel.
knows I like to ask big questions.
I know you do. And I marvel at that myself. I think, one of my, so I started out um, doing, so So I started out going to a couple of narrative research conferences in Canada. And I think one of the things, I guess, in terms of maybe advice, but just my own reflections, you you see these worlds you kind of think you want to be in, or places where you might go. And sometimes, maybe some people are lucky enough to kind of break all the way through it, but most of us need these little interim like stopover points. And so for me, this narrative research conference is an amazing professor out in the eastern provinces of Canada would host this narrative research conference. And so those were the first places I started to share my dissertation research with, which had become narrative coaching, but they really didn't have narrative coaching yet. I had to go where I felt comfortable, which was in this academic-y space. So I did a thing on narratives and depression and narratives and third spaces. But I started to get a lot of interest in what I was saying. And I said, oh, this has maybe some interest beyond what I thought. And then like 5 years before, I'd sort of dabbled into the coaching arena like in the mid 90s, but I didn't really like most coaches. I didn't really like what coaching was. It didn't fit me. And it wasn't, but so I made a couple of movements in that space and I thought, no. But I thought there's something in that, but not yet. That's, I think, an important phrase, not yet. And
Not
where you
yet.
started before about this thing about timing. So I took these things from these conferences and then through just a complete luck of the draw, I've been recruited to run a master's in OD and coaching at my alma mater. And long story short, that all fell apart, not because of me, but because of the school. And at the time, one of the faculty members said, forget that. I'm going to Australia to go to this coaching research conference. You should just come. And I said, okay, I'd never been to Australia. I had to kind of even look on the map, even where it was kind of at the time. And so I went there and stayed for a couple of days at a beachside community that reminded me of home, kind of ground myself in the new place. Went to the conference in Sydney, walked into the room that morning where I was going to be doing my session later in the morning. And I walked in the room and I said, this day will change my entire life. I
Really,
knew
you knew that. You just had a knowingness.
the minute I walked in the door, I said, this room and this place and these people will change my life. And they did. Everything that narrative coaching became started there that day, that morning.
And so
Because,
you had that prophetic knowingness just in that
yes,
moment.
because, and a woman that became my first organizational client, she ran the coaching program at a business school. She said, you have no idea how far ahead of the rest of us you are. And again, this is where you're in this dance with the ego. I could have like gone off and, oh, look at me. And, and that follow that sort of celebrity path that coaching often draws, and I had enough humility but now a growing confidence and humility kind of balancing each other out. And then Australia is where a lot of my early work was in narrative coaching. And then the rest was kind of history.
Yeah.
But I
So
want to,
go ahead.
no, but I want to go back to where you started about edge walkers, because this is a way of, you can, it's leaning into doors that open, right? So, and just being like having this sense, I think I need something like this. And I've got what I call random intuitive moves. You don't quite know why you're taking them, but you think I need to go do this. I think I'll understand why later. But in terms of edge walkers, it's really, I never thought of that until you were sharing Richard's piece. But there's a tension for people that are inclined this way, which I think more and more people are, as they start to realize the world that we live in doesn't quite work and we need to kind of find new things. There's sometimes we like hide too much in our own inner journey and get kind of in that little cubbyhole, if you will. And other times this fear that I have to go out and commoditize and productize and make it a thing. And it just drives me, like you go on like LinkedIn and things, it drives me mad. Like all these obvious things people are trying to bandy together as if they're something profoundly new. And so I realized that's not my character structure to become. And I didn't want people to follow me. I didn't want to become a thing. I'd been around too many of those people and I saw how many of them crashed and burned, or their followers crashed and burned. So I think, going back to what Richard was saying, is that it's like you're this edge walker, which means you stay in both worlds simultaneously. That the inner and inner and outer are always in conversation. You're always grounded in this center that you create for yourself and for the people that are studying with yours. And so I will, as I do in class all the time, as you would know, I'm not the point.
Yeah.
I'm just opening the door for you to find your point, and I'm creating some structure and some safety. And I've thought about this a lot, and I know this stuff really works. But you're gonna find your way through this. But you have to stay centered on the edge.
Yeah.
With,
And that is a space that, for me, the people that know me, and my sister listens to the show, so I know she's listening to this. She would say, yep, that's my sister. She's the edge walker. I will tell you though, the battle of, and you mentioned depression earlier, and I would even add anxiety to that. The battle of being the edge walker and living in two worlds at once for me has always been, I don't mind being alone like you. I love being out in nature. I've fallen so deeply in love with myself that I'm like, wow, it's pretty cool in here. So I'm just going to like go inside because it's a safe space in my imagination. However, being in that edge walker space, and I didn't have the language for this until somebody shared on Facebook, even though I know we've talked a lot about social media. I had another coach, another friend who was a coach and is still a coach. I wasn't at the time. She actually shared it on her feed and she said, I think this would be a great program. And it was W. Bex, was doing narrative coaching. And it was literally, that knowingness, exactly what you said. It was that intuitive, like, this sounds interesting. And so it wasn't until I came into your work that I started getting structure and form and language that allowed me to keep living on the edge, because the edge is not a fun place to maintain. I would say it is, and it isn't. It's fun in the sense that I can craft and create almost anything I want out there. It kind of feels like, you remember the show when we're not too far apart in age, but my name is Simon and the things I draw come true. Okay. That's what being on the edge is like for me, where I just get to create. The price at the edge is there is no conformity. There is no sense of belonging. It can feel very disorienting. It can feel lonely because everyone's having the party and you're out here going, this is coming, but everyone's at the party. And so there is a liminal space, to use your language. It was the first time I ever heard that liminal space. And if I wasn't tethered to you and to the work and the colleagues and the people I met in the cohort and the programs I was in with you, I don't know if I would have stayed out at the edge, because it's been my natural, but the world wants to draw you back in.
Yeah.
And then it'll throw you back out. Yeah. Or push you further. Yeah. So this liminal space, and while it's so cool and sexy to be like, oh, I'm an edge walker, which I have tried at cocktail parties, and they're like, is that your stage name? And I'm like, no, I'm really an edge walker. It doesn't, but I love the Native American tradition because it does mean one that walks between the two worlds.
Yeah.
Now this is becoming more normal, and your work is, I think, really advanced and out there, because I come back into the usual world and I start realizing, wow, I now have a group of people that I can feel like I'm with. And one of the things I loved that you said when I first started working with you, and I think as you evolved more into integrative development, when I did that program with you, you said the client is the moment. That was another moment that hit me really hard. It gave me permission to say, I don't have to show up all nervous and anxious, like, okay, I'm the coach, I've got all the answers, and what does David want today? And I got to make sure I impress him, because that's all ego, ego, not in the right size. It's ego that's really out front. It's not in the backbone, like you said. And so when you said this, I'm curious, when did you have that realization that you were serving the moment? Was that taught early on in seminary?
No, well, it is in terms of like the sacraments. But I think about, because I was a younger minister, you didn't get to do a lot of the fancier things. And so it happened by accident one day in my last job where I was doing a baptism. I turned out to be the granddaughter of the most prominent family in the church. And I wasn't actually supposed to do it, but then the minister got called away and he forgot. And so I'd never actually done one ever. But I love ritual and sacrament. So I'm kind of making my version of this occurrence. And I remember taking because you put your fingers in some water that's sort of been blessed, and then you put it on the child's forehead. And in seminary that we learned about, this is really like all good rites of passage, this is a rite of passage for the community, not just for the child. So, and I emphasize that about not only is this welcoming the child into the church and the world, but you're now saying we'll step up and support this child, right, as one of us. But I remember when I went to put my hand on the child's forehead, I could feel this force field between us. And part of it's, the anxiety of the moment and the drama and the pomp and circumstance. But then when I put my hand on the child's forehead, her eyes got like this. And we had this moment where we looked at each other, and I said to myself, and then somebody like, because I was supposed to be talking, but I was just dumbfounded. And then I said to myself, who's baptizing whom here?
Yeah.
And that for me was probably my earliest occurrence of what you're saying, where like there's a moment here, and it's the moment that matters the most. And I think one of the ways that's practically helped me is that when we even label ourselves as an edge walker, we've already bought into the dominant paradigm. This is a horizontal paradigm. If you move into a vertical paradigm, you are now in a channel of light, if you will, all the way to the core of the earth, all the way out into the universe. And this moment where you're the contact point in my hand on the child's forehead is that vertical shaft opens up, and I'm just a conduit for what's wanting to happen. That's what, and again, this baby's eyes are like, whoa. Because
but isn't that
believe,
true that we're all just a conduit?
Yeah, exactly. But that's what allows me to stay in that liminal space and either not feel envious or jealous or over striving or anything where you're leaning too far either way, which works for some people. It just doesn't work for me. I'm not happy with myself in those places. And I'm more effective if I stay in the center at the edge. But I can only really do that if I'm deeply rooted in moment in myself, in the earth, and I'm deeply open and less clouded of what's above me trying to come through me. And so, regardless of people's spiritual orientations or whether that's even a concept for them, I think just learning to quiet ourself and see ourselves as a participant in the moment, not a driver of the moment, or I've got to do something with this moment. Or if we just, the more we still ourselves, the more that the moment reveals itself.
Yeah. And it's such magic. I mean, I would have never found it if the breakdown didn't happen. And it is interesting, suffering and learning that suffering, the Eastern philosophies will say pain is inevitable, suffering is optional.
Yeah.
I remember hearing that going, what the heck does that mean?
Yeah.
And then inner narrative coaching and going, wait a minute, I don't have to change the story, but I do have a choice in how I tell the story.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of psychology, spirituality, metaphysical. There's so much stuff that I see woven into the experiences that you had that led to that moment where you said, this is going to change my life and to change so many other people's lives. I would not be here today. I would not be the healthy, happy, functional human being that I am. I believe this if I hadn't found your work. I really, I know that. And then then the question for me was, oh, okay, so silence and stillness in the moment, and oh, there's a place for me. And it was like my whole life had meaning and kind of created technicolor, because the narratives and the voices and the experiences I lived in were, shut up, sit down, you're too much, you're not enough, whatever this was, this non-conforming created such suffering that I remember as a kid just shutting down and never even dreaming. No, what are you going to be when you grow up? Who are you going to marry? How's life going to take you? And yet at, 40 years old, or my early 40s, I was given permission to go back and dream.
Yeah.
And recreate, but it didn't change. And I say this all the time, and the listeners know this. I don't change who my parents were, where they came from, the crazy things that happened. I do, though, go, wow, can I tell the story in a manner that I can do something different with it? and as a result of it. And as I'm saying this, you all, I don't know, David might be looking at me going, I don't think that's what I was supposed to get out of narrative coaching, but that's what I got.
It's not my,
Maybe
it's
I'm
just,
teaching it wrong. But I
no.
also love that you give permission to people that come into narrative coaching to find their own wisdom and their own path in their own way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when we can coach, we've even talked about this. I don't even know that coaching is the word, but when you offer that belief of empowerment to a human being, and then they can go then be empowering, it offers empowerment to every other experience that they're in. And then people, it's a virus of empowerment, and it just
Yeah.
spreads all over the world. So do you, with that word of coaching, do you feel like you are getting any closer to a different word?
No, and actually I was talking to a colleague this morning who was having the same dilemma. And yeah, so a lot of my um, y- y- again, I go back to what I said earlier, that a lot of the discernment is not only what seems clear and true for you, but where in the world would receive this.
Mm.
And so we're actually starting a new small program. It's going to be a free program next year, called the ARC. But it's all about how to help practitioners and graduates explain this work to other people, and bring them along as clients. And so I think about, yeah, just the ability to help us not only fit in, but find a way to enroll others in a new way of thinking, I
Mm-hmm.
think is essential.
And it's not
And
about fitting in.
no,
I
it's not.
found
I take that, but
language.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yesterday
not
I was
helpful.
working with a lady and she said, I want you to hear this. I was meant to stand out. And I'm like,
Mm,
but and I had to sit, and she goes, how does that resonate with you? And I'm like, but we're not supposed to stand out, Then, and I think I bought back into some of that old ego narrative.
yeah,
And she said, but you were meant to stand out. The not belonging is your path, is your story. What would happen if you just carried that narrative, but you carried it in a way that you're meant to stand out, so that the people that need the work that you came here to do can find you?
yeah. And see, I would argue that even standing out is as a dominant paradigm frame.
Mm-hmm. See, I was
Um,
trying to challenge her, David, and then she got me. She's like, well, I don't know. I'm like, well, maybe I was meant to stand out. Now, this is interesting.
and that's also true. That is a yes and. There's many truths here, but what I yeah, it's an interesting, and going back to the tension we feel between being our fullest, most authentic self and making a living and having an identity that's professionally solid. And so um, I have found that I do best when I just stand still,
Mm-hmm.
but not like in a corner or, in the shadows, but I stand still and allow myself to be visible. I actually have a little, where did that go? I just had this. Oh yeah. A little like affirmation I picked up in my acupuncturist office a while back. Said, make yourself visible. And so for me, it's like I want to know um, that I'm standing as still as I can, as true as I can to myself, but allow other people to see me. But also, there's people now that I don't want to have them see me because they've lost the right to see me in a way. They're not
Mm-hmm.
healthy for me. They're not. But I've found that um, so one of my shadows has always been when I lose confidence or faith in this path, then I fall into the trap of trying to be more bright and shiny. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes good things come of it, but mostly not. For me, it's because it's not me. And
Mm-hmm.
so when I stand still with clarity, and people appreciate my language often, and so they like the way that I articulate what I observe. And so if I stay true to what I've discovered my best self is, my full self is, and make myself visible in places of people I enjoy and places I belong. And so like working with Ovida, which is this AI-based company I've been working with, is one of the purest forms of that I've ever had, of working with one of their co-founders of, here's what we're trying to do. Well, here's what sits behind what you want to do. And the capacity to sense the fundamental question I ask, which is, what is this person ready for? What do
Mm.
they need most right now? And so I can sense that for him. And so I can say, well, how about this? He goes, oh, and then he'll operationalize that. Here's what you have now. Here's what that means. And so we just sort of scaffold our way up. And so I think it's really just finding a way to stand in what you believe in a way that allows you to be open and clear. So you're not out front where you have to believe what I believe, or you have to do it my way, but not also being a wallflower saying, "Oh, please find me, please find me."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it's that really you're standing on the threshold, you're standing at the edge, but in a way that is centering for you and clear for others.
And I love that visual of, can you just stand still and be who you really are in the noise and chaos of what's out there to try to stand out. You know, can the more outrageous and the more outlandish
Yeah.
and the more whatever, you do get attention. However, it is short-lived. It is very, out of proportion ego. And so if we can stand still, we're actually doing the exact opposite of everyone else, which eventually does get awareness and attention from
Yes.
people that see that. And so I love that. And it's also making me think of something. I listened recently to James Finley, and he was talking about, that very few of us, especially those that have experienced trauma, but that very few people know how to stop, to stand still and be
Mm.
present with themselves, much less anyone else, without invading or abandoning.
Yeah, it's true.
And I thought, wow, that's really important language. And he said, so, and I thought about the narrative coaching and the Moment Institute and all of our work together. And I thought, that's what I'm learning and have been learning as a practitioner
Mm.
myself, is how am I present with myself? And how can I be in that presence and then not invade and abandon
Mm.
myself?
Yeah.
And then I'm learning how to do that with clients and with friends and with family members until it becomes a social norm for me. That's been so powerful, so healing. And not in, I love those words, and I just love the language of, and not invading and abandoning,
Yeah. I love
because
it.
that's usually what happens to a lot of us who get wounded at that level, that believe we don't belong, nobody wants us, that trauma, the wounding that occurs. And he said something else that really resonated with me. And back to, you were talking about that little baby with the eyes wide eyed when
Mm.
it recognized you. And he said, when infants do not have the mirroring from their caregivers, looking them in the eyes to show them their own self-worth, they develop a belief that is the very blind spot of their own identity and being.
Mm.
And then they're raised without the ability to even see it in themselves.
Yeah.
And so I know I have moments of that from my life. And I also healed through that with narrative coaching. And I've seen it with clients.
Yeah.
And I think you've mentioned that before. The rule in coaching is, oh, just mirror it. And if you show them, they'll get. You can't always mirror, because sometimes people, their patterning, I learned, was to not even see the mirror.
Yeah.
So this work that you're doing is so important and so needed, and I think powerful. And so it's spreading out into the world. And one of the ways I describe you, David, and I remember in narrative coaching, the matrix, and learning all that, and
Yeah.
how my brain works, and creating all these cool structures, and just going out there and doing the work. And I was very much in the inhale.
Mm-hmm.
And then in narrative release, you brought the other side of the coin. And I'm like, oh shit, I've been working all this time to write the story, take in the information. And then there was this, no, now it's time to exhale.
Mm-hmm.
The narrative release space. One of the ways I describe you to people, and I have very few people I could probably put 5 on in my whole world, that I feel like I get to exhale with.
Mm.
And so I really, for the listeners out there, we're so consumption oriented. We're so busy. We're so, look at me. And like you said, this shiny and this activity and this movement. But the opposite is true of just shutting up. For me, that's my language, getting silent, getting still, and exhaling.
Yeah.
And releasing is so needed right now in the world.
Yeah.
And so I love that when I'm with you, my whole nervous system says, I can exhale.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about the exhale, the other side of narrative coaching, in just the heels of that stillness and that presence of being who you are, the necessity that you see for the world to exhale?
Yeah. Well, actually, in the breathing model that we sort of piloted in that first year, it's become much more of a mature model now. And so we actually teach that as an integral part of ID now. But it's a model that begins with exhale,
Yeah.
and, which is a bit odd for people, but follows the same flow as narrative coaching, but it's a descent into maturity.
Yeah.
What do I need? What do I need to let go of about how I see this situation or see myself? What do I need to release to surrender to what actually needs to be happening here? And that we find that to be extraordinarily powerful. And I think, in terms of where this work is going now, around the need for exhale, I was thinking back to a client years ago. A colleague and I were pitching they had done kind of rudimentary coaching skills in their large organization at very superficial levels. And so they wanted a more advanced program. Well, and so we won the bid because in the interview, I modeled this work for the woman. And she was blown away by what happened like in 2 minutes. And she said, "We want that." What I learned in hindsight, which is the world desperately needs this, but we were too far of a leap for her. But in the program that we did for HR team to kind of pilot this and try it out, there were some extraordinary experiences that people had. But it completely freaked out the HR director because we are an inhaling culture. There's no, how do we do this? And these people are, they're having these profound liberating experiences. I remember there's one woman that when we were doing a little bit debrief, they'd all kind of come back from their practice pods and all kind of sitting in their rows again. And there was a woman in the front row was kind of sitting down about 1 o'clock from me. And I was sharing what I was observing, and I wasn't sharing any information, but I was just acknowledging what I had been witnessing. And I knew that she had been through this profound experience, and this little, for us as narrative coaches, it was pretty minor, but for them it was, and I just, at one point I looked at her and she saw that I was looking at her, and she was, and I said, and I basically nodded to say, "It's okay." And so she's weeping, but she's in the front row, so no one sees that she's weeping. And she says, "Thank you." And so, you just saw that, and that's why we're trying to bring ID to the world in a different way now, because so NR, the narrative release, and the ID are now in the same program in a way. We're going to do some more advanced NR stuff later, but it's because I started to realize that like you've described, to actually do integrative development, you need the deeper work of narrative release to ground yourself, to stand in those raw learning moments with people. If you haven't, then it becomes just a methodology, just a whatever. And I feel like we need release now more than ever, and it's also harder to find. And so for me, that's really where ID is going, and my greatest interest is in continuing to add logs to that campfire, but really around the conversation. How do we make it possible for more people to exhale?
Yeah. How do we make it possible for more people to exhale? I love that question. And I love that through the work with you, you've taught me you get permission to just live the question. You don't have to jump right in and go, "Let me tell you how to do it."
Yeah.
And this idea of exhaling and just being, and I've said this before and people kind of chuckle at me, but I'm like, we're constipated on content. I mean, and you and I are talking about leadership development, and yes, narrative release is very real and alive in the corporate world with the work that we've done, and also in other practitioners. And so as narrative coaching and then narrative release and integrative development have all come together, I'm seeing, and I know the people that are listening to this show may be in the corporate space as well, but I'm taking that work, and while I still love my corporate clients, I'm turning out towards the consumer with a lot of my products and a lot of my work, and saying, narrative release, narrative coaching, integrative development is needed in all ways, in schools, in corporate, in healthcare. We were talking about that, in just the consumer world. That's always been a passion of mine. That, to say, gosh, if I got this from this, what could somebody else get? You know, I'm a high school
Mhm.
dropout. I don't have any accolades or any whatever. I had this rough story. How many other people out there are suffering who would love to say, oh, I don't have to get rid of the story and become somebody else. I can just learn another version of the story. And you mean my life might drastically improve?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I love that the work that you're doing is allowing all of us to say, we're in this, we're on the, I feel like the visual is we're on the edge with you. And that's what I love about you is we're co-creating. There's this Moment Institute where we're all studying and we've been on the edge looking in as we consume. And then now we're facing out and then we're looking at where can we go? And
Yeah.
I think the circle of the work is just going to get bigger
Yeah.
as we all move out towards the people out there who are curious about, well, what is narrative coaching and integrative
Mm.
development? And hey, I think I'd like some of that. And we're just at the beginning. Where
Yeah.
that's going to go is going to be incredible. So we've got a few minutes left before we wrap up. And my listeners know this. I would talk to you for hours and hours and hours. Well, against your will and wishes, I'm sure you're like, oh my gosh, I always have to put a beginning and end date with Yedda.
Mm.
I just love this stuff. And this inner security comes up as you were talking,
Mm.
cultivating inner security, the power to rewrite stories, the ability to exhale and say, I can put this down. Somebody
Yeah.
else gave it to me. It's not mine. I don't want it. You use the analogy of, pack light on the
Yeah.
journey. And so all of these nuances and one-liners and nuggets of wisdom that I've gained from you. So I want to make sure we have a few more minutes before we go, but I want to have time
Sure.
as you talk a little bit about what's the vision that you have for the world.
Mm. That's a big question.
I ask big
So
ones.
yeah, I know. It's excellent. So I'll be 70 in a few years. And so I've um I've been on this journey that started about a year ago through a lost suitcase and a blizzard, and it began this journey that I was on, and I felt like I could tell something was coming, but I didn't know what. And then small surgery, long COVID, now we're a year later, and it's the culmination of this arc of this journey I've been on for a year. And it was largely to wake me up that I was in a sort of a pre-eldering phase, I suppose. And so I'm starting a new book series, taking all these three bodies of work and writing like a 100-page book for beginners. I was inspired in part because my daughter's about 21, is in Germany and university, and we've always been quite close. And the three chairs that I do, and she called me one day and said, "I won't believe it. I did the three chairs with Mike, her boyfriend, because he was really struggling with a decision about school, and he's a very bright and very cerebral kind of guy, but he's like, what? Three chairs? What are the chairs for? So
Yeah. Past,
just
present,
trust me."
future.
Exactly. Just trust me. My dad taught me this. And so he said, okay, fine. He loves her. So he went along, and it's like, wow. And his decision was made like that.
Yeah.
And so I
It's
thought,
all
well,
right here.
exactly.
Always right here.
And so my vision really is for, you know, the universe has been around for over 13 billion years. So in some ways, it doesn't really matter what I do or what I think. And at the same time, I thought, I want to create more uh, resources for others to take with them. And so it's almost like packing lunches for field trips,
Mm-hmm.
that I want to create smaller bits, more accessible bits, break all this lifetime of work down into smaller pieces that people can take with them. They can use to plant trees under which I'll never sit. But that, yeah, so we're exploring through our offers for next year how to do more of that, to equip people. Again, from a consumer perspective, I'm a narrative coach. I have to go do these things. And I said, well, narrative coaching is a way of life in many ways. It's all based on the
Mm.
same philosophy. So now I've been challenged to write the book about the philosophy that underpins all of this. So that'll be a project in the works, but it's more equipping people to take this into spaces they care about. And
Mm-hmm.
so I feel like um, that what's going to emerge is And because people were like, how do we deal with climate change, and how do we deal with sort of reactionary, autocratic, violent forces? How do we deal with disparities in the economies? And I said, well, I don't know, but it's going to come to me from, as it has throughout all of history, with people who plant seeds and create small experiments for people to try in their kitchen, in their neighborhood, on the farm, wherever, to begin to find some new language about how to be and talk to each other. Because in the end, for me, the Earth has been through hundreds of phases in its billions of years of existence. It has hundreds of more phases, which may or may not include us. We're not the point of the universe. We're not the point of the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, it allows me to relax and say, okay, great. So how do I, in this current experiment of being a species on the planet, how do we help people contribute to the longevity of that and the sustainability of that, but also around how can I live a better and different life if I worked with my stories and our collective stories in new ways. And so that's my interest, and it's going to come. And so it's trapped in coaching right now. So that's ID was liberated from coaching. And now what will come eventually is liberating it from all those forms.
Mm-hmm.
It just becomes a non-dogmatic, non-doctrinal way of being in the world.
I love that. And the vision that I could see as you were sharing that was thinking about exactly that narrative coaching, moving out, that circle moving out into a way of really relearning the art and the arc of storytelling in a way that we realize we're all telling stories. We're telling stories about our lives, about each other's lives, about what we see on TV, what we see on social media, what we don't see. Everything is just a story. And as you were explaining that, I really firmly believe that this work has the ability to change social norms and belief systems for future generations. And so for the listeners, don't worry, we're going to talk a lot more about narrative coaching now that you've had this little introduction.
Yeah.
So David, we always put it in the show notes. Where would you encourage someone to come and just check out more of what you're doing? What site would you send them to? We'll put it all in the notes, don't worry. But a lot of times people are busy driving or doing things that they remember auditorily.
Well, we're in the middle of rebuilding all of the websites, and by the end of this month, they should all be up, getting ready for next year. So if you just go to themomentinstitute.com.
Okay.
And we have a free monthly call called the Beyond Coaching Experience. We had a lot of visitors who come kind of check it out. It's all experiential. We give you a sample of what we do, so you can, even if you never come back, you'll have a great hour and a half.
Oh, I can attest to that. I love those calls.
Yeah. So we have those now, and we're starting a new one now about sort of seed planting that will start in the spring next year in the Northern Hemisphere and fall in the South. And then we're also going to create in the middle of next year the opportunity for people to do self-directed versions of the programs.
Okay.
And so we're working on that as well, and that's in the works, and we'll be out probably late summer next year. So I think just come by. We have a online community you can join for free and participate in other things there. So if you just go to the website, you can sign up, and then you can sign up for the community. Then you have access to some more things. And for me, it's just like we're trying to set it up so I'm not at the front of the business as much anymore. So I have more time to go write and create things for the community and find people doing interesting projects using this work where I can lend a hand and support them and bring those. But the whole point is to create a series of case studies, a series of smaller tools, easier ways for people to.
Block by King Von.
No, thank you. Siri gets so excited, and
I know Siri starts to talk sometimes to me. That's why I had to start taking my Apple Watch off whenever I was doing things. So I love that. So you can go to themomentinstitute.com. What I love about this is even if you are not a coach or you're going, I don't have any interest in being a coach. What I love about this work is the narrative coaching, narrative release, integrative development content and platforms. anybody and everybody can benefit from those. I say that
Yes.
hands down. So
Yeah.
whether you go all in and you become certified, or you come in and you experience the community, there is something here for everyone. I'm a firm believer that this should be in curriculum at school. It should
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
all over the place. And so as this grows and evolves and expands more out into the world, as you all are listening, please go check it out. There's some really great resources out there. Of course, more will be in the show notes. And now I get permission, because I've been wanting to have the audience really understand. She talks about these one-liners. I always say, well, my teacher David, or my spiritual
Yeah.
this, or narrative
Yeah.
that. And so now you've heard firsthand from the teacher, from we won't call you a guru, from the edge walker that is out there on the edge, showing us and teaching all of us that, hey, this is what's coming. It's an honor, it's a privilege to be here with you. And one last thing before we wrap up, because you gave so many pieces of wisdom there. I always give the speaker the ability at the very end. You've got the microphone, there's no question. What is on your heart and mind that you would like to leave the listener with before we end the show today?
Well, for me, it really goes back to the power of the exhale. So I'm working on this project with the Institute of Coaching at Harvard on this framework I've called the 5 maturities. And it's helping us move beyond competency models as a way of assessing and developing coaches, but in reality, anybody. Because I feel like we're measuring the wrong things. We're not really understanding about the humanity of a practitioner. And so the 5 maturities, my wish, I suppose, for listeners is everything that's brought you to this place in your life can add value for you if you know how to use it. And that ultimately regardless of the role you're in, yes, it's important to be competent. Yes, it's important to know what you're doing. Yes, it's important to keep evolving what you're doing. But my observation is that more than anything else, what the world needs from us is to mature, which is not about inhaling. It's not about consumption. It's about shedding, curating, channeling, composting all the stuff we don't need anymore, and thanking it for what it did for us and letting it go, giving it back to the earth. So we're free and liberated to be present with people in the moment, to help them mature themselves. And when we come from a mature place, then we realize we have way more than we might even need. And we don't need to chase. We don't need to consume. We don't need to be threatened by people that are different, because we stand in our own mature abundance, and with all the good and the bad and the ugly of that. And as a whole human being. And then from that, everything else is possible.
So standing in our mature abundance as human beings, and we find that place, you all, by the power of the exhale.
Yeah.
So David, I'd like to exhale with you. Listeners, please, this is your moment. Take a big, deep breath in and exhale. Keep inhaling and exhaling. And until the next time we get together, remember, you matter simply because you exist. Thank you, David, so much for your presence, for your time, for your teachings. And we will see you on the next episode. Make it a great day.